Growing up, my sister and I had no love for our father. He was an alcoholic, abusive, and violent, a man who left scars instead of memories. When my sister moved away for high school, I was only 4. The 10-year age gap felt like an abyss as I dealt with him alone. At the time, I resented her for leaving, but as an adult, I understand. We've since made peace. Our small town revolved around a single factory where nearly everyone worked, including my parents. But when the defense ministry took over, workers without high school diplomas were let go. My mother was fired just months after having me, while my father kept his job until retirement. His pension nearly doubled after being granted military status, but with that came an expectation to act accordingly. Of course, he never did. My childhood was filled with nightmares, so much so that when I turned 18, I enlisted in the military. It was free, and more importantly, it was an escape. For the first time, I could leave that hell behind. 3 years later, I received an honorable discharge due to mental health issues I didn't even know I had. The payout and insurance gave me a fresh start. I returned home briefly but quickly realized my father hadn't changed. His parting words to me, "You'll never make it," were a mix of spite and disbelief. He couldn't stand the person I'd become, someone who no longer obeyed him. I moved to the city where my sister lived, took a blue-collar job, and started working toward an IT career. I also began focusing on my mental health, determined to build a life far away from my father's shadow. A few years later, my father was diagnosed with cancer. Although it wasn't immediately life-threatening, he needed multiple operations. By then, my sister had reconciled with him, partly for our mother's sake. She even took on the financial burden of his treatment, covering hospital bills, surgeries, and recovery. Despite his sizable pension, he didn't spend a dime. My sister, meanwhile, was juggling her own expenses, buying her first car and moving into a new house. I visited after each of his surgeries, but there was no heartfelt connection. As long as he didn't provoke me, I kept things civil. At the same time, I was barely scraping by. Working, studying, and relying on a social program for mental health treatment left me exhausted. Eventually, my father and mother returned to their home after his recovery. Around this time, I landed a new job that gave me the flexibility to finish my IT studies and a better environment for my mental health. Life seemed to be stabilizing until my mother called one day, crying. She suspected my father was having an affair. At first, I dismissed it, chalking it up to her paranoia. I didn't want to waste a 4-hour trip on something so trivial, so I reassured her and let it go. Months later, my sister called with news of her pregnancy. She visited our parents to share the joy, but the celebration quickly turned into chaos. My father's phone, left unattended, lit up with an explicit picture from his mistress. My mother, seeing this, exploded in rage. Screaming matches ensued, culminating in my father trying to hit her. My sister, 3 months pregnant, stepped between them, forcing her husband to intervene. They eventually left, bringing my mother and the phone with them. We urged our mother to divorce him, but her deep-seated beliefs about marriage held her back. She clung to the hope that he might change, despite 35 years of evidence to the contrary. Unable to convince her, my sister and I decided to cut him out of our lives entirely. But my father wasn't done with us. Half a year later, his side of the family began contacting me. They tried to lure me back with kindness, but I knew they had ulterior motives. Their true intentions surfaced when I visited. They wanted to sell the house he'd transferred to me before his surgery, along with the land my grandmother had deeded to me. Both were now legally mine, and they saw a chance to cash in. Sensing trouble, I left quickly, pretending I had an emergency. On the drive back, a plan began to take shape. That evening, I discussed it with my sister and mother. For the first time, my mother was open to standing up for herself. With my sister's help, we consulted a lawyer to explore our options. Legally, the house and land were mine, and no one could claim them without my consent. Even if they tried to frame it as rented property, they'd face massive logistical hurdles. The lawyer also confirmed that if my mother divorced my father, she could claim half the house's value, provided we could prove his infidelity. That's when I remembered the broken phone my mother had brought back after their fight. I had kept it out of laziness, tossing it into my storage loft instead of throwing it away. It was damaged, but we managed to extract enough data to prove my father's ongoing affair. Armed with this evidence, we were ready to act. I informed my father that I'd visit to make an important announcement. When I arrived with a lawyer in tow, the welcome party's smiles vanished. The air grew tense as I laid out his choices: either relinquish all claims to the house or face a lawsuit. In our country, infidelity carries penalties ranging from probation to prison time, and the evidence we had was damning. He exploded, screaming and calling us names, but I held firm. At the first court hearing, he resorted to lying about my mother, painting her as the villain. The presiding officer seemed inclined to side with him, prompting our lawyer to suspect favoritism. We declined the officer's suggestion to settle out of court and pushed for a formal hearing. In the second session, overwhelmed by mounting evidence and the threat of jail time, my father finally agreed to our terms. He relinquished any claim to the house, allowing my mother to remain its sole rightful occupant. As a gesture of twisted mercy, I permitted him to live there for the rest of his life, but barred anyone else, including his mistress, from staying with him. With the legal battle over, we turned to a different kind of reckoning. My sister compiled a folder of receipts documenting every expense she'd covered during his cancer treatment. While demanding repayment from one's parents is frowned upon in our culture, we had no qualms about being petty. We filed a small claims case, knowing it wouldn't hold up in a criminal court but was legally sufficient to force action. When my father failed to pay, the bailiff, an unapologetically tough woman, sent officers to seize his belongings. They took everything of value, including furniture, a smart TV, and even a massage chair, all items my sister had originally bought. He had to pay the rest from his savings, which wiped out nearly 70% of his remaining wealth. Next, I reported his misconduct to the organization managing his pension. His military rank, tied to a code of conduct, was revoked after an internal review. This halved his pension, leaving him with barely enough to get by. Gossip about his downfall spread quickly, and my mother reveled in it, sharing the news with her friends. As if that wasn't enough, my aunt, who was deeply in debt, showed up at my sister's house to berate her. She even shouted at my niece and nephew, which pushed me over the edge. I discovered that my aunt had been posting lavish photos on Facebook while dodging creditors. I created a throwaway account, befriended her, and sent her photos to everyone she owed money to. The fallout was immediate. Thugs harassed her with paint, fish sauce, and even feces. Ultimately, she had to sell her house to pay off her debts. But the final blow came at the annual family ceremony. My father's side of the family, unaware of the full story, still saw him as the family head. My mother changed that by sharing the truth with everyone. Overnight, my father became a pariah. To seal his humiliation, my uncle proposed making me the family head. The elders agreed, and I delivered the ceremonial speech in my father's place. At the banquet, he wasn't even allowed to sit with the heads of family branches. Instead, he was relegated to a side table with gossipy widows who openly mocked him. My father's life fell apart after that. His mistress left him, taking whatever dignity he had left. Stripped of his rank and with his savings nearly gone, he now lives alone in the old house, barely scraping by on his reduced pension. His cancer returned, but this time my sister refused to help. He tried reaching out to my mother, pleading for reconciliation. She was tempted, but we blocked his number and social media to protect her from herself. Despite everything, she still had a soft spot for him, but we weren't about to let him manipulate her again. As for my aunt, the fallout from her debts left her in a small house with no way to recover her former lifestyle. Her husband, a decent but indecisive man, stayed by her side, though he clearly didn't deserve the mess she dragged him into. Their son, a spitting image of her entitled behavior, is a lost cause. My grandmother, who had always doted on my father, remains in her small home. Though I've distanced myself from her emotionally, I visit once a year during Lunar New Year out of respect. Her unwavering love for my father saddens me, but she was kind to me growing up, and I hold on to those memories. When she and my father eventually pass, I'll honor her wish to build an altar for her and my grandfather. Whether my father's name joins theirs on that altar is a decision I'll make when the time comes. Through it all, I've come to terms with my actions. None of this would have happened if my father had chosen honesty over deceit and violence. He had every chance to part ways peacefully, but he burned those bridges himself. Life has moved on. My sister continues to thrive, her children are growing up happy, and I'm finally building a stable career while managing my mental health. For the first time, the future feels open and free from his shadow. If you enjoyed this story or found it thought-provoking, check out my channel for more like it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about the power of resilience and how to take back control of your life.